Preparing position papers. One of the things that seems to give students the most stress is the idea of putting together a position paper in professional ethics. Now, position papers are very simply opinions of a particular moral issue, namely your opinion. So the idea here is that you would read a particular case that's been assigned and then argue for your view of how the case ought to be resolved, what the correct course of action is. So when doing a position paper, it's not only your opinion, but it's about well-argued and principled opinions. So the idea here is that within the context of a professional ethics class, you've been introduced to several moral theories. You've been introduced to several moral principles that may apply directly to the case at hand. In fact, in most cases, will relate back to the material that you've just covered in the chapter. So when you're arguing for a particular position, I would expect that it would be an informed argument. Now, there's some very basic guidelines for thinking about your position paper, and these guidelines are found in Appendix 2 in the back of your book. So what Appendix 2 is doing is not telling you how to write the position paper, at least not the first half of Appendix 2. What Appendix 2 is really doing is emphasizing how you ought to think about the case. So it's helpful if you follow the guidelines in Appendix 2 by writing down the sorts of things it asks you to. Now, some of those things are, for instance, getting out the relevant facts. The relevant facts of the case may be things that are morally relevant to the particular situation. Whose responsibility is something might be one of the relevant facts. How do others view the particular situation might be relevant. What the circumstances are. All of those may be relevant to any particular case. Now, since we're obviously dealing with a moral dilemma, otherwise there would be no need for a position to be taken. A dilemma here, by the way, is where two values or principles seem to conflict in a particular case. So when looking at any case, you want to ask yourself, what is the conflict? What values are at issue? For instance, in some contexts, you might find that liberty is at odds with equality, say. So I can, for instance, in society, treat everyone equally, but sometimes requiring equality may mean that I curtail someone's liberty. And you may ask, justifiably, is it okay for me to make someone a little less free to keep everyone equal? And that's when we have some sort of moral dilemma. And in such cases, when we have conflicting values or conflicting principles, we want to know, well, which principle ought we to go with? Now, once you've come up with this list of the relevant facts, and you've clarified the values at issue, and there may be a number of values, you want to reflect on your list. Now, what this means is you shouldn't be writing your position paper the night before it's due. It's best if you read the case, sort of write down all those facts and principles or values that you think are relevant to determining the outcome, and maybe put them away for a day. Take a look at it, come up with maybe your initial reaction to the case, put them aside and come back to it the next day, reflect on that list, and then, of course, come up with your decision. Now, when I say make and articulate your decision, it's very helpful, especially when you go to actually write the position paper, that you're able to state very clearly what your position is going to be. So, unlike what occurs in, say, an English composition class, since you have only 2.5 to 3 pages for your position paper, you want to get to the point right from the beginning. So you may want to say something as blatant as, in this paper I will argue that the correct action is X. Or in this paper I will argue that the individual's responsibility is to do Y. So right from the beginning you should be able to say exactly what your position is on the case. The last thing you want to do in a position paper is to go back and forth, be indecisive. In this case, you are forced to make a decision. Normally these cases are very specific, and in such cases, there isn't any room for the person in the particular moral dilemma, or if you're pretending you're the person with this moral dilemma, you can't not make a decision. So you want to take a firm stand one way or the other and articulate that decision. Once you figure out what position you want to take, you need to justify that position. So the justification will come by noting the moral principles at stake, maybe bringing out some relevant facts, using those facts to support your case for a particular course of action. Now, one thing that seems to be difficult for students is to criticize their own view. So once you've come to a conclusion, what you want to do is note that in a dilemma, a moral dilemma, there are often equally good or almost as good arguments on the other side. So what you should do in a good position paper is recognize the weaknesses of your own view. So you might say, well, All in all, I believe the individual in this case study ought to do this particular action. But I can understand how some would object, because Y and Z are also relevant, but I think that X is still the best course of action. So you want to anticipate those criticisms and clarify the costs of your view. So you might say, well, my view entails this. It might have these bad side effects, but overall I think it's still the correct course of action. So let's take an actual example. This is case 4, the nurse's dilemma, from page 4 and 5 in your textbook. I'll use this to just briefly go over how you should look at a case before you actually sit down to write it. And of course, now would be a good time to read the case if you haven't read it or if you don't remember what the case stated. Okay, so in case 4, we have a situation where a nurse is asked directly by a patient the nature of her condition. Well, presumably she's asked when she'll be discharged because no one has told her that she has a very serious illness. Now, what facts are relevant to this case? Well, here are a few facts that I've picked out from the case on page 4 and 5. First of all, you are the nurse, or you are the patient's primary care nurse, which means you have a direct responsibility to that patient. The patient has asked you a direct question about her health, so it's not a situation where you may feel compelled to say something to her because you know information she didn't ask for. But in this case, the patient themselves has asked you for that information. The physician is aware and approves of withholding of the information, so the physician believes that the morally right or correct course of action is to withhold this information. And the family, the people closest to the person with the disease, also believe that you should withhold the information. So those may all be relevant facts about the case. Now, what are the conflicting moral values? Well, there may be any number of conflicting moral values. Beneficence, benefit or do good. So in a hospital, the doctor in this case is presuming that the best way to help the patient, to do good for the patient, is to keep that information from her. So the doctor feels that there would be a greater harm caused by giving her this information than if you kept the information secret. Non-malfeasance is another obligation that we often hear about in the medical profession. That's do no harm. So this goes right with beneficence. If my job as a physician is to benefit my patient and to not harm my patient, in this case the doctor seems to be acting in accordance with those two principles. And the nurse too is an assistant to the doctor, is one interested in helping patients. Maybe those two principles are relevant. Autonomy is another principle that may conflict here, because while beneficence and non-malfeasance may in some instances indicate I shouldn't tell the patient the true nature of their condition, that's also not respecting the patient's autonomy, the right to decide for themselves how they want to lead their life or what information they ought to have. The patient at no time has indicated to anyone that she wants to be kept in the dark about her condition. Dignity, respecting the patient as a competent adult. Note that one of the facts in the case that the patient is not mentally incompetent in any way. So to respect an individual's dignity, to treat them as an adult, as a rational being, I might say that by not telling her this information, I'm not treating her in this way. And of course, rights can go along with this. A right to autonomy or a right to information about one's condition may all be part of the medical code. I might think as a nurse, my obligation is to protect my patient's right as an advocate. So being an advocate for a patient might mean my obligation, and note that word obligation indicates some sort of moral duty. My obligation might be to say to the patient, you are not being treated correctly. I must be an advocate for a patient in this sort of situation. Now, I'm not going to actually tell you how it would come down on this particular case, but I would say once I've listed all those facts, and maybe in the course of looking at it or thinking about it, I come up with new facts, so I want to revise my list. But once I've revised my list of principles and facts and values, I might then go through and say, which principles do I feel the strongest about? Which ones do I think are the ones most relevant to determining what I should do if I were the nurse in this situation? And which facts lend support to that? So the fact that the patient is not incompetent, the fact that the patient directly asked about being discharged, the fact that the patient was assuming based on her demeanor that maybe everything was okay, so she was feeling upbeat, which indicates that she wanted to know what was going on. She had a desire to know about her actual case. Maybe those are all facts which support the particular principle I may come down on. It may also be the case that the information given by her daughters might be relevant. I might feel that if, in fact, the mental stress that would come from telling her the actual nature of condition would harm her, then maybe the harm principle in this case takes precedent. Maybe that notion of beneficence and non-malfeasance actually override the notion of autonomy or dignity in this particular case. But that's something you're going to have to decide if you were actually doing this case. Now, at the end, as I mentioned, the question is, can you state your view in a single sentence? Can you now say, so for instance, in this case, you might say, in this case, I believe the nurse ought to tell the patient the true nature of their condition. I hold this is the morally correct action because, and then you would go on. In the same respect, you might say, I believe the nurse would be wrong to divulge the information to this patient. The reason I believe this is the following. So you want to make sure that you can articulate your decision in a way that essentially states your thesis for the paper. Once you've gotten to this stage, you're pretty much well on your way to actually writing the paper. So the justification, as I've already mentioned, once you've actually just reflected on these ideas, come up with your thesis, now you want to look back and pick those principles which you listed that are relevant and the facts that apply. And again, in this case, I might look at this situation, and either way you come down on this particular case, it's possible that there's a criticism. So if someone takes the fact that she's been under immense stress means that you could harm her psychologically and maybe physically, that is, she becomes depressed, and that has physical ramifications, which makes it harder for her to get well or to handle the therapy that she's been given, then you might say, well, see, those who argue about informing must acknowledge that there might be some mental strife, there might be some physical harm. On the other side, those who argue that we want to avoid the psychological and maybe physical harm have to also acknowledge that later on when she finds out, it may actually be the case that she becomes angry or that there's some resentment for the lack of ability to prepare for the poor treatment outcomes. What happens if, in fact, her case grows worse and she's unable to make plans or do things that she would otherwise have wanted to do prior to her untimely death, and the sort of psychological harm that may come later, even if she does, in fact, require or become better. So you want to anticipate these criticisms and mention them, and if possible, respond to them, saying, for instance, while I acknowledge this sort of harm may come about, I still think that it's overridden by this for this reason. Now, finally, the one thing that I can say that most students seem to forget, or perhaps doing a paper very late the night before it's due, you should write your paper, read your paper, rewrite, and then repeat the whole thing. What oftentimes happens is when you write a paper and you fail to read it, that is to actually stop, and I personally recommend reading it out loud. Ask yourself whether you understand the paper. Read the paper out loud. Does it make sense? Remember, I'm not concerned here with philosophical jargon. I'm not concerned with big fancy words or long quotes from the text. What I want is a well-reasoned, well-argued paper that says, here's what I believe, in this case the nurse, should do, and here's why. And here's some possible criticisms of my view, or the shortcomings of my view, and here's how I would respond to those criticisms. So really, that's all you need to do with the position paper, is really give me a well-reasoned, informed opinion about a particular case. As I mentioned in the syllabus, the cases themselves should be about 2.5 to 3 typed, double-spaced type pages. I would like these 1-inch margins, top, bottom, left, and right. Give me a standard font, 12-point font, Garaman, Times New Roman, no wingdings, nothing crazy like that. And then make sure you attach that assignment, the file, to the assignment page in WebCT, and then that way it will be sent to me. As far as getting feedback on these, I will make the papers available for your viewing in the philosophy department. As part of the philosophy department's evaluation of outcomes, some of your papers may be held with your names removed anonymously as an indicator of how well we're doing as far as prepping you in writing and in critical thinking. So these papers will be available for your viewing in the philosophy department, but you're going to have to leave them there after you've viewed them. So I will inform you by email when papers are ready for you to pick up, or at least come and view if you'd like to do so. And that's pretty much it. Good luck on your paper. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me through the WebCT email, and I will get back to you as soon as possible.